I was never too interested in the plants or animals that made up the place I lived in. All I interpreted was mountains covered in cedars, cut through by large cold rivers that salmon came from, and the black bears that would feast on them. That all changed this year when an indigenous guest speaker came to my foods class to take us to the woods and show us the native plants and their medicinal uses. At the end of the presentation, I asked her a question. How many of these plants are native, and how many of them are invasive, like a ratio? And she replied that she didn't actually know. So in this video, I'm going to take you through some of the plants and animals in my region and see who's winning in the battle of life. The native species or the invasive. Some of the footage you'll see in this video is my drive down Squamish Valley Road and then my drive down Paradise Valley. It's shocking to see the difference in the two roads from an area being deforested not too long ago and an area with trees nearing 100 years of age. Since I will be talking about these species in the context of BC, I will be using the English spelling and pronunciation. However, I do mention species in relation to my hometown of Squamish located in the Squamish Nation. Let's start with trees. Unlike my naive perception of all trees mostly being cedar, there are many different species of trees that make up all the undisturbed forests. Because of the climate, almost all the trees in the coast of BC are evergreen. There are only a few different types of species, but they consist of spruce, pine, fir, hemlock, and of course, cedar. These evergreen trees are also classified in construction as softwood. The hardwood trees we have mainly stick along the rivers and areas with more sun. These consist of maple and alder. And in case you're wondering, you cannot harvest maple syrup from the maples as the climate has to be extremely specific for that. Looking at you, Central Quebec. All these indigenous trees held great medicinal value to the First Nations. For example, the Douglas fir tree's bark or leaves were used in tea to treat pain. Gum was gathered from the spruce tree's resin and was widely used for treating wounds and given to mothers to chew who had recently given birth. The stems of the needles were also chewed on because they were a good source of vitamin C. And the bark of alder trees was made into a tea to treat internal issues like stomach pain and lung problems. Throughout most of BC's history, the indigenous people would use cedar for almost everything. Bark was used in clothing, the leaves were used in tea, and of course, as their primary wood for construction. Although cedar is a softwood, it has an amazing weather resistance, warp resistance, and even though today you wouldn't use cedar for building large structures, the first peoples might have gotten a safety violation, but they used it to build large longhouses and other buildings. But because this is a video on invasive species, I'll show you the invasive trees. BC's climate, and for the most part sensible loggers, have led to invasive trees not being too big of an issue in BC. But that hasn't stopped trees such as birch, English holly, the tree of heaven, and the worst of all, willow, from making its way into the forests. Where I live, the willow is the most invasive tree. To clarify, I am not talking about the popular and beautiful tree, the weeping willow, as they are mostly planted in isolated areas, but almost always the planters don't know the consequences of planting a willow. The roots seem to grow wherever they want to and will push through cement, pipes, and power lines. Willows will also grow extremely quick, well, in comparison to other trees at least. The willow I'm talking about is the fast-growing Pacific willow. Wherever there's a moist climate and enough space, the willow will weed its way into a forest. The problem with willows is that their wood isn't useful in construction, so they often are not cut down. And when it is time to cut them down, they grow so densely, very thin, and tall, it's often hard to do so, and it costs a lot. To summarize and look at the battle of trees between the native and invasive, the native trees are probably the least affected and valiant fighters than all the other native species in BC. Today you'll only find the invasive trees around urban areas that were likely planted and haven't been able to spread far, especially for the evergreens, leaving us a win for the native trees versus the invasive. A lot of smaller wildlife that you would just consider commonplace here actually isn't native, and some are even classified as invasive. Interestingly, a lot of species originated from the eastern part of North America, but because of the new ease of transportation and climate, some small animals have almost driven out their native counterparts, such as gray squirrels, bullfrogs, and Asian slugs. For big animals such as deer, wolves, and bears, the only real survivors are the bears, who still prosper in relatively the same numbers as before. Black bears are very abundant, but grizzly bears, as only a few years ago, were considered endangered. The government put in place rules about hunting grizzlies and to protect them, but their population has bounced back, leading to more bear attacks in the province. Salmon is a species native to BC, which includes pink, sockeye, chum, chinook, and coho salmon. Salmon has, for its existence, almost been an invasive species in itself due to their mating cycle taking up almost all the rivers that lead into the coast, potentially driving out other fish that use the same freshwater breeding strategy. But you can't classify salmon as an invasive species because the entire ecosystem has grown around them, including the indigenous people. In the 1930s, the government started to plant trout in various lakes in BC, which didn't have any notable impact on other species. But throughout Canada's history and BC's history, the government understood the importance of salmon. So far, no other foreign fish has been able to rival the mighty salmon, leaving a win for the native salmon of BC. Today, the BC government actively has programs and funding to help the spawning of salmon each year. In fact, almost all aquatic life in BC is native, because life in the ocean can simply find its way to the other side of the world. People bringing marine life in boats hasn't had an impact because the ocean has already balanced itself out. Sadly, the Eurasian species of mussels and crabs have been displaced by those types of species. The biggest threat to marine life in BC is the actions of humans causing climate change, not foreign species. In the end, the animals that for the most part lost to their invasive counterparts are rodents, deers, and birds, as well as many others. The native animals that have won include fish, marine mammals, bears, as well as many more. Just like all ancient civilizations throughout the Americas, the first peoples had dogs. The most popular dogs that share descendants with pre-contact dogs today are huskies and chihuahuas. Although, just like the people of the Americas, diseases brought by the colonizers wiped out even more of the population of dogs than it did humans. And even with dogs surviving, the European dogs were much more favorable, driving them out more. Absolutely no purebred, pre-contact dog exists today. The people that claim they are just half of half-breeds. The dog I will be discussing in this segment is the Salish Wool Dog. This dog was widely used by the Coast Salish people for wool for blankets, since they did not have any form of sheep. These dogs spanned from Washington state all the way up to northern BC. Captain George Vancouver had written about them and was surprised that their fur was even more dense than sheep wool and seemed almost superior to it. The problem with shearing dogs is that it could only be done once a year, and a whole pack of dogs could only yield enough material for a few blankets, leaving the use for these blankets to be used as highly valuable gifts. They were said to be almost as valuable as slaves. Another interesting thing about these dogs is that they would either be a family's house dog or the complete opposite, as literal sheep, livestock. It was imperative that the breed be kept as pure as possible. Often the dogs were kept in isolated places, only having human contact to be fed and sheared. Under no circumstance would they mingle with other dogs or be used for hunting. The dogs of Vancouver Island would be kept on small islands in large packs of 20 to 30, and on the coast they were often kept inside caves, being fed a diet of cooked or raw salmon. The woolly dogs became extinct around the 1800s because of the European breeds being bred over that bred with the purebreds. Also, with the advent of wool blankets being cheaper and were more practical, as well as the Indian Act banning potlucks and other indigenous ceremonies, the use for these ceremonial blankets dwindled, as well as the dogs themselves. The last reported sighting of a wool dog was in the 1940s in a mostly isolated indigenous reserve. The claim is still unproven. So, unfortunately for the native dogs, it is a complete loss to foreign species. One of the most invasive species where I live is English ivy. In any urban area where there's trees, English ivy has covered them. Alternatively, a native species, false lily of the valley, is the plant mainly competing with English ivy. In the springtime, when you go out on your regular walk in the trail, One day, what seems like it happens overnight, the entire forest floor is covered with false lily of the valley. Lily of the valley is a plant native to Europe, but although being a completely different species and don't overlap or grow in the same climate, it is being called false lily of the valley because the leaves are vaguely similar. English ivy, on the other hand, is an evergreen plant and highly resistant to weather. Unlike false lily of the valley, it can cover trees and drive out moss because it's a vine-like plant. Both of these plants need an adequate amount of sun to survive, which is why you won't find them in heavily forested areas like in your normal temperate rainforest climate. Another invasive plant is the Himalayan blackberry. When the speaker came to our class, they mentioned that the Squamish Nation has simply come to accept the invasive species due to how prominent it is. The only indigenous blackberries can ironically be found in much higher elevations in BC due to the Himalayan blackberry covering much of the flatlands. For the plants, unfortunately, many smaller shrubs have been driven out by the more aggressive ones, and heavily forested areas without much sun is where you'll find the true OG plants, your ferns, mushrooms, and a lot of moss. In conclusion, just from observation, I can tell the invasive plants haven't driven out most of the native ones where I live. Our trees eventually outcompete with the invasive ones, our fish are as strong as ever, the animals that are most prominently portrayed in First Nations art are still what we see today, except for the ravens. I don't see them around much anymore. Damn crows. A lot of the plants are still very diverse, and invasive species don't seem to pop up unless a very large area was recently cut down or were deliberately planted. After traveling around town, I could only say the true ratio is 1 to 2 foreign plants for every native one. And even though these plants don't come from here, it's important to remember that they are just plants, and most don't affect the ecosystem and are usually quite pretty. I just had to answer this question for myself. The balance of plants and animals where I live, where I call home, is a very good one. Thank you for watching.